Shalom, hello, welcome to Gefet in the Daf. I'm Yael Shimoni, bringing to you together with Hadran and Yeshivat Drisha, learning Iyun in your Daf Yomi B'Kiyut, and we're in Zevachim, a few dafim here talking about the mizbach, and we're gonna travel around the mystery of the copper altar, mizbach hanechoshet. What is the connection between mizbach hanechoshet, the copper altar, and the altar of the haolah, mizbach haolah? We know that in the desert, Moshe had a copper altar, but somehow it seems as if the whole sugiyot here assume, at least that's what it sounds to the Rashi and Tosafot, that in Bet HaMikdash the altar was not made out of copper. Let's see what happens here, and are there cholkim? And what's the whole story about the altar? Did it disappear? Why did it change? If it changed at all? So we're going to do Tanakh, we're going to do a few sugiyot and Machoket Rishonim Be'ezrat Hashem. And I don't think this is a regular Gefet. You'll see it's slightly different. Again, Zevachim sort of help us go into different and interesting different ways of learning that we didn't do together before. Okay, so let's begin with questions about the copper altar. What happened? What happened to the mizbach hanechoshet in Beit HaMikdash? Was it still there? Wasn't it there? Was it hidden? If so, who hid it and when and why? And why did the altar in the Beit HaMikdash change while all the other vessels remained the same? What does it mean? Okay, so I don't know if we'll be able to answer all of these questions, but Bezrat Hashem, a few of them. Let's begin Bichlal in Masechet Yoma. Masechet Yoma says that there were many differences between the first temple and the second temple. There we know that a few of the vessels were hidden. אלו חמישה דברים שהיו בין בית מקדש ראשון למקדש שני, ואלו הן ארון וכפורת וכרובים. We know that the aron and the kaporet and the kruvim disappeared in the second temple. They were really hidden. Esh v'shchina, the sugya here says that there was a different fire in the first temple and a different fire in the second temple. Ruach HaKodesh and Urim v'Tumim, which is another piece of a vessel. It's really part of the Choshen that also disappeared. But here we don't see anything describing what happened to mizbach hanechoshet, to the copper altar, and also we don't see here things that change from the Mishkan to the mizbach, meaning no vessel disappeared. The disappearing of vessels happened between the first and the second temple, not between the Mishkan and the mizbach, the Mishkan and the Mikdash. So what happened to the copper altar? Why did it disappear? Did it disappear? So let's move to our sugya. We're in Zevachim, Nuntet, Amud Aleph, and Amud Bet. There we have a machoket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi about Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo, who built the first temple, and there's a description that he was bringing a lot of olot on the day of Chanukat HaMizbeach. And then we have a pasuk that says that the mizbeach was too small, a mizbeach katan mehachil. And then there's a machoket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda, what exactly happened there? So Rabbi Yehuda says, the Tanya, ביום ההוא קידש המלך תוך החצר, כי מזבח הנחושת אשר לפני השם קטן מאכיל, דברים ככתבם דברי רבי יהודה. So Rashi here explains, according to Rabbi Yehuda, what happened when there were too many korbanot, שקידש את הרצפה כולה לשם מזבח להקטיר עליה, says Rashi. דברים ככתבם. It says in the Torah that there wasn't enough room, so what did Shlomo do? He turned the whole floor into a mizbach. קידש את הרצפה כולה לשם מזבח. זה דברים ככתבם. What about רבי יוסי? והלא כבר נאמר 1,000 עולות יעלה שלמה על המזבח ההוא, ולבית עולמים הוא אומר ויזבח שלמה את זבח השלמים אשר זבח להשם בקר 22,000. כשאתה מגיע לחשבון עולות ולמניין אמות זה גדול מזה, אלא מה הוא קטן מאכיל? כי האדם אומר לחברו פלוני לנסו ופסול לעבודה. Rabbi Yossi says, I can prove from other pesukim that the mizbech that Shlomo built was actually much larger than the original mizbech of Moshe. And it doesn't mean that the mizbech was so small that it was the same size as Moshe's mizbech, and that's why you had to create the whole floor as a mizbech. No, the new mizbech was actually very big. Still, there was a problem, and what happened? You could shecht on the floor, but you still had to throw the blood on the mizbech. That's according to Rabbi Yossi. So what's the machoket between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda about the altar? So according to Rabbi Yehuda, when Shlomo built Beit HaMikdash, he built a new altar for some unknown reason. According to Rashi, it was exactly the same size as the copper altar, exactly the same size. And for some unknown reason, Rabbi Yehuda took away, it says that Shlomo HaMelech took away the copper altar, not because it was too small, but because for some reason he didn't want copper, he wanted it to be stone. According to Rabbi Yossi, why was that altar hidden? Because it was too small. And that's why Shlomo had to build a new altar because he needed a much bigger altar. So both of them agree, according to Rashi, that the altar was hid at that day. The big machloket is whether or not Shlomo built a bigger altar, that's what Rabbi Yossi says, or the same size altar, according to Rabbi Yehuda. That's the Gemara in Nutet. Now, if we move forward to the Gemara in Masechet Zevachim, Daf Ayin Aleph, the Gemara asks about Rabbi Yehuda and about Rabbi Yossi. We understand Rabbi Yehuda's shita because in the Torah it says that Shlomo kidesh et haritzpah, that Shlomo took the floor and turned it into a mizbach. Bishlama leRabbi Yehuda haynu dichtiv kidesh. Ela leRabbi Yossi mai kidesh. According to Rabbi Yossi, actually Shlomo built a bigger altar. There was no problem room-wise, so why did he have to change something regarding the floor? So says the Gemara, he had to change the floor because he needed more room for the temple and more room for the altar. And since Moshe's altar was smaller, there was only a section in the floor that was kadosh for that altar. And he had to add a bigger section because he built a bigger altar. Okay, now we understand both Rabbi Yehuda and both Rabbi Yossi. Bishlama leRabbi Yossi haynu dichtiv katan, ela leRabbi Yehuda mai katan. So here's a good question for Rabbi Yehuda, right? Rabbi Yehuda said that the new altar that Shlomo built was exactly the same size as Shlomo. So why did he build that? Why did he do something that was exactly the same size? Hachi ke'amar. mizbach avanim she'asa Shlomo tachat mizbach hanechoshet katan haya. Okay, so here the Gemara really says that Shlomo did a new altar that was made out of stone. Tachat, instead, right? The word tachat here sounds as if instead the old copper altar. So the word tachat be'ivrit has two meanings. One is instead, and the other is underneath. Let's see again, according to Rashi and Tosafot, how do they read this passage in the Gemara? Is it instead or is it underneath? So according to Rashi, hachi ke'amar. ומשום דקאי במקום מזבח הנחושת וחילופו הוא קרא לה מזבח הנחושת. ובדברי הימים קרא לה בהדיא ויעש המלך מזבח נחושת, כף אמר אורכו וכף אמר רוחבו, והמקום המערכה כאן. So according to Rashi, he really said that tachat means instead. משום דקאי במקום מזבח הנחושת וחילופו. And Tosafot also thinks the same. Tosafot says, הכי כאמר, מזבח אבנים שעשה שלמה תחת מזבח הנחושת, תימא סס תוספות, ובפרק במסכת שבס, ויעמוד אצל מזבח הנחושת, מזבח הנחושת מהווה, אמר להם הקדוש ברוך הוא, התחילו ממקום שאומרים שירה לפניי בכלי נחושת, ואמר לו אמר כי הכה, ויש לומר דהתה אמר לו להזכיר מזבח הנחושת כלל. So here Tosafot says there's a different sugya that actually says that there was no copper at all. So obviously this mizbach is instead and not underneath. So I don't know if you've noticed, but both Rashi and both Tosafot brought other pesukim that actually in the Torah, this mizbach in Beit HaMikdash is called mizbach hanechoshet many, many times. In a moment, we'll open up all these pesukim and look what it sounds like in the Torah. But first, let's understand more why do Rashi and Tosafot think that there was no copper mizbach. They're building on this sugya. That this sugya said tachat mizbach hanechoshet. We said you could read it in two ways. Tachat is underneath, or tachat is instead. And it seems as if Rashi is right. This is instead. And Tosafot is also sending us to Masechet Shabbos. What's in Masechet Shabbos? So in Masechet Shabbos, they're quoting a pasuk from Yechezkel that is describing a very bad nevuah churban, that people are coming, malachim, angels, are coming to be mashchit Jerusalem, and they start by standing next to mizbech hanechoshet. That's what's written there in the pesukim. And then the Gemara says, mizbach hanechoshet mi hava. The Gemara says, mizbach hanechoshet? There is no mizbach hanechoshet. And then the answer of the sugya, Amar Lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hatchilu mimakom sheomrim shira lefanai, and here Rashi and Tosafot explain, Ma ze mimakom sheomrim shira lefanai, what's written here in the Gemara? The Gemara here reads the Torah. The Torah says that there was a copper altar, and then the Gemara says, but there was no copper altar. We know that. Where do we know that? Maybe our sugyot and Zevachim. So what does it mean, copper temple, a copper altar? Says the Gemara, since you sing in front of God, the Levi'im, when they sing, they use copper instruments. So it doesn't mean that the altar was made out of copper. It means that there were copper instruments around the altar. And that's what Masachet Shabbos here says. And now we can understand the Tosafot in our sugya. The Tosafot is also very adamant, like Rashi, that there was no copper altar. Even if there is a mentioning of copper, it's not on the altar. It's things that are around the altar, like music instruments and other things. So here we see both Rashi and Tosafot, and let's just repeat that. Also Rabbi Yehuda and also Rabbi Yossi agree, according to Rashi and Tosafot, that in Bet HaMikdash there was no copper altar. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the copper altar was exactly the same size as the new mizbach that Shlomo built. And whenever it says that there was a copper altar, it doesn't mean there was a copper altar. No. There was no copper altar. There were maybe other copper instruments around. And of course, Rabbi Yossi thinks that Shlomo built a bigger copper altar, a bigger altar, and of course it wasn't made out of copper. So here we saw the sugiyot, we saw Rashi and Tosafot, and maybe you are convinced by Rashi and Tosafot. But let's take a moment to look at the Tanakh. And in the Tanakh, let's see, there are many, many pesukim that call the altar in Beit HaMikdash a copper altar. In the Rabbanit, it says, ויכל שלמה לבנות את בית השם בירושלים, ויעש מזבח נחושת 20 אמה. This is the pasuk that Rashi quoted. Here it really says, ויעש מזבח נחושת. Shlomo built a copper altar. It doesn't say that it was built out of rocks and not copper. It says a copper altar. In דברי הימים ב', פרק ז', פסוק ז', ויקדש שלמה לתוך החצר אשר לפני בית השם, כי עשה שם העולות ואת חלבי השלמים, כי מזבח הנחושת אשר עשה שלמה לא יכול להכיל את העולה ואת המנחה ואת החלבים. Here another pasuk, mizbach hanechoshet, the copper altar asher asa Shlomo that Solomon built was too small. These are the two things that were in our sugya in Machloket. When you read them in the Pshat, it sounds very obvious that there was a copper altar. But let's continue. Also in Melachim, it says, ביום ההוא קידש המלך לתוך החצר לפני השם, כי עשה שם את המנחה ואת חלב השלמים, כי מזבח הנחושת אשר לפני השם, קטן מלהאכיל את העולה ואת המנחה ואת השלמים. So here you see in Melachim, it doesn't say mizbach hanechoshet asher asa Shlomo. It says mizbach hanechoshet asher lifnei Hashem. That's true, but in Divrei Amim it says that Shlomo built a copper altar. And let's move to Yechezkel. That's the pasuk in Shabbat Nun Hey. והנה שישה אנשים באים מדרך שער העליון אשר מפני צפון, ואיש כלי מפצו בידו ואיש אחד בתוכם לבוש בדים, וכסת הסופר במותניו, ויבואו ויעמדו אצל מזבח hanechoshet. In the Pshat, it sounds that the altar was made out of the choshet. But even if all these pesukim didn't convince you, because that's what Rashi and Tosafot explained, let's see this story. The story in Melachim of Achaz. Achaz is in a very difficult situation. He's looking for help from Tiglat-Pileser, Melech Ashur, and he helps him. And then Achaz goes to Damascus and sees there a big altar of Avodah Zarah. And he sends to Uriah Cohen and tells him, build a similar altar back in Bet HaMikdash. And then the pesukim say, ויבוא המלך מדמשק, וירא המלך את המזבח, ויקרב המלך על המזבח וירא על עליו, ואת מזבח הנחושת אשר לפני השם, ויקרב מאת פני הבית מבין המזבח ובין בית השם, ויתן אותו לערך המזבח צפון. So here we see that what happened in the time of Achaz. Achaz decided to build another mizbach, a mizbach for Avodah Zarah in Bet HaMikdash, and then he took the copper altar and moved it aside. So here it is very hard to say that there wasn't a copper altar, because let's understand how did the copper altar work in the Bindal? We know that it was made out of copper, and every time it was rebuilt and then poured into it land and soil. So it's actually movable. That's the whole concept. Since you move around in the midbar. That's why you have to have an altar that is movable. So you might have argued that when we came to Eretz Yisrael, it wasn't moved anymore. But here in the story in Menachim of Achaz, you see that it was moved again. So you can't move a mizbach that it's made out of rocks and connect it to the ground. You can move mizbach hanechoshet. So you have a pasuk here of mizbach hanechoshet and also a description of it being moved. So this is much harder to explain according to Rashi and Tosafot, and it didn't actually talk about that in our sugya. But Rashi on the Torah reads these pesukim and gives a very strange explanation, because this is a big chak in the Shita of Rashi. Let's see what Rashi says here in the Chumash, not in the Chumash, in the Nach. ואת מזבח הנחושת ויקרב, says Rashi, אי אפשר לומר מזבח הנחושת שעשה משה, שהרי נגנז. It can't be Moshe's mizbach. It can't be that altar, because we know that altar was hidden. That's, of course, what we know. ואי אפשר לומר מזבח אבנים שעשה שלמה, וקראו מזבח הנחושת, שהרי אי אפשר לקרבו מזווית לזווית. It can't also be the old altar of Shlomo, because you can't move that altar. So what's written here? Says Rashi, what's written here? He didn't mean move any altar. What did he move? אין לי לפרש מזבח זה, אלא בכיורות ומכונות של נחושת שהיו צורכי מזבח. So you see, this is the big chak on the Shita of Rashi and Tosafot. How to read these pesukim? And Rashi here says, I don't know how to read them, so I'll tell you. He didn't move an altar that was made out of copper. He moved other copper instruments. So I think you too feel that the Shita of Rashi and Tosafot in reading the sugya has a big chak from the Nach. Is there any other Rishon who read this differently? So the answer is yes. We have another Rishon, and there's a way to reach him if you're learning Zevachim. There's the David, who's a Parshan on Zevachim, who tells us that if we'll go to the Ralbag, he'll have a different answer. So I went to the Ralbag. What did the Ralbag on Melachim say? So the Ralbag says, ביום ההוא קידש המזבח לתוך החצר. רוצה לומר, כי מרוב הקורבנות שהקריבו ביום ההוא טרח שלמה לקדש החצר. ושם כתוב בביאור, כי מזבח הנחושת שעשה שלמה קטון מהאכיל, והנה קרא אותו מזבח הנחושת, לפי שהיה מצופה נחושת, אבל תחתיו היה של אבנים שלמות, כמו שנזכר בתורה, אבנים שלמות תבנה את מזבח אלוקיך. So according to the Ralbag, yes, according to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, the altar in Bet HaMikdash was made out of stone, but it was covered in copper. Actually, it was built exactly in the same method as the altar of Moshe, the copper outering, and inside there was a filling. And since that's how it's built, the filling can be taken out and it can be moved. So now we can understand the pesukim and achaz. Now, of course, the big machloket between the Ralbag and Rashi is, how does Bet HaMikdash look? Is the mizbech made out of copper or not? And according to Rabbi Yehuda, are we still using the mizbech of Moshe or not? Because according to the Ralbag, actually, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Shlomo's altar was also covered with copper, and maybe according to Rabbi Yehuda, it was that original altar of Moshe, because it was exactly the same size, only it had a different filling. According to Rabbi Yossi, it was a new altar, because he had to have a bigger size, but it was made in a similar method of copper on the outside and the inside made out of stone. Now, it is interesting that the Malbim also offers this as an answer, but says it's a tchak. And he says, I don't think this works with the pesukim, but I wanted to show you that I think it works very well with the pesukim and with the Gemara, because this way we can go back to the Gemara and say, when it says, tachat mizbach hanechoshet, doesn't mean instead, it means mizbach avanim underneath mizbach hanechoshet. That was the filling of mizbach hanechoshet. But here we still need to understand what happened. Why is there this change between the mizbach in the desert and the mizbach here in Bet HaMikdash? Now, for Rashi and Tosafot, we gave an interesting explanation. Why did we have a copper altar in the midbar? Because we had to move around, right? That was the story. We had to rebuild the mizbach. It had to be the same size all the time. So we were using that copper outer mizbach so we can refill it each time. But according to Ralbag, we don't need a movable mizbach in Bet HaMikdash. So what happens when we come to Bet HaMikdash? what is the meaning of putting inside rock? We understand, according to Rashi and Tosafot, the change between mizbach adama, a soil mizbach, and mizbach avanim means from a movable mizbach to a standing mizbach, an unmovable mizbach. But according to Ralbag, what is the big significance of changing what's inside of the mizbach? So here, I want to offer really a thought of mine based on a Gemara that you saw a week before. The Gemara Masechet Nedarim tries to understand how you build a mizbach, because we know that the mizbach, you cannot put on it any kind of barzel. I lost the word in English. Barzel. Okay, you know what I mean. You can't cut it with in barzel. So how do you build the mizbach? In the Mishkan, they use the shamir, which is this miraculous creature. But what do we do now? We don't have that miracle. So Levi says, how do you build a mizbach? You fill it up with avanim mefulamot and sid and zefet. Okay, what are avanim mefulamot? So Tosfot and Rashi say avanim mefulamot are wet stones. What does it mean, wet stones? So how do stones are cut if they're not cut by copper, or they're not cut by the stuff that we use? There's one way that you can shape stones and make them smaller in nature. That's water. Water takes stones and soothes them and makes them smaller into small pieces. So that's what Rashi and Tosafot tell us. When we read this Gemara, the rock that you use in order to build a temple, if you can't have miracles, you're using rocks that were crafted by water. Now, this is really, really fascinating, because the mizbech is built for fire, but the inside of the mizbech is actually water, or at least soil that was crafted by water. And this connection between water and fire, that's the meaning of the mizbech when we come to Eretz Yisrael. And if we look in Masechet Chagiga and Perek Endorshim that talks about the creation of the world, so Masechet Chagiga says, how was the world created? First, he had tohu and bohu. What are bohu? Bohu are rocks crafted in water. And if we take this and connect it to the building of the mizbech, and what's the meaning of coming to Eretz Yisrael and filling up the copper, not with soil, but with stones that are crafted by water, it is actually telling us that when we come to Eretz Yisrael and we build the temple, and we build a mizbech in the temple, we're connecting to the beginning of the world, because the temple is built around Even Hashtiyah, the place where the world was created, and the mizbech is actually a symbol of how God created the world. How did God create the world? He made peace between fire and water. That's how he made the sky. He made peace between tohu and bohu. He separated them. So here we see that coming to Eretz Yisrael adds to the copper altar the meaning of this is the place where the world was created. This is the place where fire and water come together and create peace. And that's how the world is built. So according to what we saw today, we saw there is a machloket between Rashi and the Ralbag. According to Rashi and Tosafot, according to the way that they read the Gemara says that there was no copper. The copper disappeared, and it was part of the desert story. It's not part of Eretz Yisrael story. And we can understand that because we understand that we needed the copper to move the altar around. And here in Eretz Yisrael, we don't need that anymore. In the Mikdash, the altar stands in one place. There's a lot of hardship dafka in the Nach, with what Rashi and Tosafot say. The Gemara they read perfectly, but the Nach is hard because in the Nach it sounds as if the altar was made out of copper and it was actually movable. And Ralbag says, yes, that's the truth. Actually, it was built in the same method. It was movable, but it was filled with stones instead of with land. And here we were wondering, what does that mean? We understand the difference between desert and coming to the land, movable and unchangeable. But what does it mean, the change of soil and of rock? And here we explain what kind of rock was there inside the temple. It's rocks which are actually crafted by water. And the connection between water and fire, that's the symbolism of the altar Dafka in Eretz Yisrael, because Eretz Yisrael is the place where the world started from. That's Jerusalem, that's Even Hashtiyah, that's where the mizbach stands. So I hope you enjoyed this Gefet. I think it was slightly different than other Gefetot I've done, but Baruch Hashem, learning Zevachim is super interesting and a good time to imagine and understand how did Beit HaMikdash look, and Bezrat Hashem. So we'll see Beit HaMikdash and see with our own eyes what will be the sugya, is it according to Rashi and Tosafot or according to Ralbag. So take care, and we'll meet again soon, Bezrat Hashem.